They did not lose a battle. They did not lose a war. They lost something far more important. By sunrise, more than 6,000 warriors were still alive. Their weapons were intact, their armor untouched, their banners still standing. But not a single command was given. No orders, no formations, no response. Because during the night, 200 men did not attack the army. They erased its brain. This is not a story about overwhelming force. It is not a story about courage on the battlefield. And it is definitely not a story about fair combat. This is the story of how assassins dismantled an entire military system, silently, methodically, and in a single night. And once you understand how it happened, you will never look at warfare the same way again. Before that night, the army was considered untouchable. 6,000 warriors, veterans of countless campaigns, men who had survived sieges, ambushes, open field battles, and years of constant war. They were trained to endure chaos, to fight while surrounded, to hold the line while everything burned around them. But there was one thing they had never trained for: a world without command. Their strength did not come from numbers alone. It came from structure. Every unit knew its place. Every officer knew his superior. Every soldier knew exactly whose voice to obey. Orders flowed downward like blood through veins. Signals, horns, runners, flags in the dark. This army did not rely on improvisation. It relied on control. And control has a single point of failure: leadership. Each commander was more than just a fighter. He was a node in a living system. Remove one, and dozens hesitate. Remove several, and entire units stop moving. Remove enough, and the system collapses under its own weight. The army did not know it yet, but that night, it was already dead. Because while thousands slept believing they were protected by walls, guards, and numbers, 200 assassins were already moving. They did not come as an army. They came as shadows. No banners, no war cries, no visible formation. They were selected not for strength, but for discipline. Not for rage, but for patience. Not for loyalty to a cause, but loyalty to silence. From the beginning, they were trained for one purpose: to kill without being seen, to move without being remembered, to strike without leaving chaos behind. These men did not seek glory. They did not expect recognition. Most of them did not expect to survive. They were not heroes. They were instruments. Their training was brutal, not because it demanded violence, but because it demanded restraint. They learned how to wait, how to listen, how to stand inches from an enemy and do nothing. They studied routines, sleep cycles, guard rotations. They memorized the hierarchy of command like a map of vital organs. Who commands whom? Who replaces whom? Who sleeps closest to power? Because the goal was never to kill many. The goal was to kill the right ones. The plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. No open battle, no alarms, no panic until it was too late. Every assassin was assigned a name. Every name was a commander. Not soldiers, not guards, not messengers. Only the men whose absence would create silence. If even one alarm was raised too early, the operation would fail. If even one commander survived long enough to issue orders, the system might adapt. That is why it had to happen in one night, one coordinated collapse. Some commanders were killed in their sleep. Others never reached for their weapons. A few realized what was happening seconds before it ended. But there were no screams echoing through the camp, no sudden clash of steel, only doors opening, breaths stopping, and bodies quietly left behind. By midnight, the command structure was already fracturing. By the deepest hours of darkness, it no longer existed. And the army, still asleep, had no idea. What makes this night so terrifying is not the number of deaths, it is the absence of resistance. 6,000 trained warriors stood only meters away, yet not a single organized defense was formed. Because without commanders, no one knew who was in charge. Without orders, no one knew when to act. Without direction, discipline turned into hesitation. By the time the first signs of confusion appeared, it was already over. This is where most stories would end. But this is not the end, because the true destruction did not happen during the night. It happened at dawn. And what followed would prove a brutal truth of warfare. You do not need to destroy an army to defeat it. You only need to destroy its command system. If you're still listening, understand this. This story is not about the past. It is about how wars are actually won. And the most dangerous weapons are often the quietest ones. The operation did not begin with violence. It began with timing. Every assassin moved according to a window measured not in minutes, but in heartbeats. Too early, and guards would still be alert. Too late, and dawn would expose them all. This was the moment when discipline mattered more than courage. 200 men crossed invisible lines in the dark. Not together, not loudly. They moved in fragments, small units that knew nothing beyond their own target. Because the fewer who knew the full picture, the quieter the night would remain. The camp itself was alive with false security. Fires burned low, guards leaned on spears, bored and half asleep. Veteran soldiers trusted routine more than instinct. After weeks of marching and fighting, exhaustion had replaced paranoia, and exhaustion is the ally of assassins. The first targets were not the highest-ranking commanders. They were the connectors, lieutenants, messengers, men responsible for relaying orders. Cut the nerves before touching the brain. One by one, these men disappeared from the system. No alarms followed. No sudden movement rippled through the camp, only silence. Each assassination followed the same principle: speed over struggle, precision over brutality, silence over everything. A hand over the mouth, a blade where armor did not exist, a body lowered, not dropped. Every assassin was trained to leave the scene exactly as he found it. Doors closed, curtains untouched, no signs of intrusion. Because panic spreads faster than blood, and panic was not the goal. As the night deepened, the targets changed. Now came the commanders, men who had led thousands, men whose voices had once decided the movement of entire armies. Some slept surrounded by guards who never realized they were already irrelevant. Others slept alone, confident in reputation rather than protection. Reputation offers no defense in the dark. One commander reached for a weapon. He did not make it. Another tried to shout. No sound escaped. Several never even woke. Their deaths were not dramatic. They were efficient. And efficiency was the most terrifying thing of all. By the time half the commanders were dead, the camp still slept. This is the part most people struggle to understand. How could so many die without anyone noticing? The answer is simple. Armies are trained to react to noise. They are not trained to react to absence. No screams meant no threat. No fire meant no alarm. No visible enemy meant no reason to mobilize. The assassins exploited this perfectly. Midnight passed, and something invisible but irreversible happened. The chain of command snapped. Messages stopped moving. Orders stopped forming. Authority dissolved into uncertainty. Even if a commander had survived, he would have had no one left to command. The system had already failed. At this stage, the assassins did not rush. They slowed down. Rushing creates mistakes. Mistakes create witnesses. They checked names, confirmed deaths, adjusted routes. Some targets had moved. Some were missing. Those men were hunted next. Because leaving even one node alive could allow the system to rebuild itself, and rebuilding was not an option. In several sections of the camp, guards sensed that something was wrong. Not danger, wrongness, a quiet that felt heavier than sleep. But suspicion without authority leads nowhere. Who do you report to when command no longer exists? By the deepest hours of night, the assassins began to withdraw. Not because the mission was incomplete, but because staying longer increased risk. Not of failure, but of unnecessary noise. Their objective had already been achieved. The army was intact and completely paralyzed. When the last assassin vanished into the darkness, the camp looked unchanged. Fires still burned, tents still stood, weapons remained stacked and ready. Nothing looked destroyed, but everything that mattered was gone. Dawn was approaching, and with it, the moment when 6,000 warriors would wake up and realize they were alone. Because when morning comes, an army does not ask how many enemies remain. It asks one question: who is in command? And this time, no one would answer. Dawn did not arrive with violence. It arrived with confusion. The first soldiers woke the way soldiers always do, slowly, unwillingly, expecting routine. They reached for weapons, adjusted armor, looked for familiar signals. Nothing seemed wrong. And that was the most dangerous moment of all. A runner was sent to deliver the first report of the morning. He did not return. Another was sent. Then another. Each disappeared into the maze of tents and command quarters. Still, no alarm was sounded, because alarms require authority, and authority no longer existed. Small units began forming instinctively. Veterans gathered men they trusted. Sergeants tried to impose order, but every attempt ended the same way. Who gave the order? Who's in charge? Where's the commander? No one knew, and without answers, discipline began to rot from the inside. By full daylight, the truth could no longer be hidden. Command tents were opened. Inside, bodies were found. Men who had ruled through certainty now lay silent and unmoving. The realization spread faster than panic. The entire command structure was gone, not damaged, gone. This is the moment when an army usually fights back, but there was nothing to fight. No enemy lines, no advancing force, no visible threat, only absence. And absence is harder to confront than an attacker. Orders began to contradict each other. One unit prepared to advance, another prepared to retreat. A third refused to move at all. Every decision created more uncertainty. Every attempt at leadership was challenged, because rank without confirmation is meaningless. Some officers tried to assume command. They shouted, they threatened, they promised order. But authority is not claimed, it is recognized, and recognition requires a system that no longer existed. Soon, arguments replaced formations. Fear replaced discipline. Men who had stood firm against cavalry charges now hesitated in open daylight. Because courage is not just personal, it is collective, and collectives require structure. By mid-morning, the army was still intact, but operationally dead. Scouts were sent in every direction, each returning with different reports. Some claimed the enemy was approaching, others claimed there was no enemy at all. No one could verify anything, because verification requires coordination, and coordination had died in the dark. This is when desertions began. Not mass flight, small, quiet departures. A few men here, a few there. Warriors who realized that survival now depended on individual decisions, and individual decisions are the opposite of an army. The assassins were already gone, but their presence remained everywhere, in every unanswered question, in every delayed order, in every moment of hesitation. They no longer needed to kill. The system was destroying itself. By noon, the army no longer functioned as a single force. It had become a collection of armed men sharing the same space, without unity, without direction, without purpose. 6,000 warriors, zero command. This is why what happened that night was worse than a massacre. A massacre creates anger. Anger creates resistance. This created doubt, and doubt dissolves armies. The commanders had not been symbols, they had been anchors, and once removed, everything drifted apart. By the end of the day, the outcome was inevitable. The army would retreat, fragment, or surrender, not because it had been defeated in battle, but because it could no longer act as an army. This is the true power of what happened that night. 200 assassins did not destroy 6,000 warriors. They removed the one thing numbers can never replace: control. Most people believe wars are decided by strength, by numbers, by weapons, by who hits harder and longer. This belief survives because it is simple, and because true answers are rarely simple. What happened that night exposed a reality most armies prefer not to acknowledge. An army is not a collection of fighters. It is a system. And like any system, it does not fail evenly. It fails at critical points. Command is not just leadership. It is timing, coordination, trust. It is the invisible agreement that when one man speaks, thousands move. Once that agreement is broken, nothing else matters. Weapons become weight. Armor becomes burden. Training becomes memory without purpose. The assassins understood this. They did not waste effort on symbols or spectacle. They did not seek to inspire fear through destruction. They sought silence, because silence is where systems die. Every army depends on predictability, wake cycles, guard shifts, command routines. These patterns create efficiency. They also create vulnerability. The more organized a force becomes, the more catastrophic the loss of command will be. Discipline amplifies power, but it also amplifies collapse. This is why the killings of commanders collapsed the entire command system, not because those men were irreplaceable individuals, but because replacement requires time, and time was never given. In theory, every commander has a successor. In reality, succession depends on communication. Who is alive? Who has authority? Who confirms the chain? That night answered none of these questions, and unanswered questions paralyze action. History is filled with armies that lost battles. Very few lost themselves. This was one of those rare moments, because what died was not morale, but coherence. When soldiers fight, they fight for each other. When armies fight, they fight through structure. Destroy the structure, and courage has nowhere to go. This is why no counterattack came at dawn, why no rallies succeeded, why no emergency command emerged. Because emergency leadership requires recognition, and recognition requires legitimacy, which had been erased quietly, methodically, and completely. The assassins did not need to remain. Their work was finished the moment confusion became permanent. After that, every hour made recovery less likely. Every argument weakened unity. Every delay hardened doubt. This is the paradox of military power. The stronger the system, the more devastating its collapse. The more disciplined the force, the more helpless it becomes without direction. The army that night had been trained to obey flawlessly, so when obedience lost its source, nothing replaced it. This method of warfare would echo far beyond that single night. Not always through assassins, sometimes through airstrikes, sometimes through sabotage, sometimes through deception. Different tools, same principle. Remove command, let the system destroy itself. Modern warfare still obeys this rule. Technology has changed, speed has increased, but command remains the true battlefield. Because no matter how advanced an army becomes, someone still has to give the order. And that is the most uncomfortable truth of all. Wars are not won by the many. They are won by the few, who understand where power truly lives. If you're still listening, you already understand more than most. Not because you know the names or dates, but because you understand the mechanism. The story is almost finished, but the lesson is not. Because what happened that night was not an exception. It was a demonstration. The army did not collapse all at once. It unraveled, slowly, quietly, almost politely. There was no final charge, no last stand, no dramatic moment when thousands realized the truth together. Instead, realization arrived in fragments, and fragments are harder to resist. By the second day, movement replaced paralysis, but it was not coordinated movement. It was drift. Units began to leave their positions, not under orders, but under assumption. Some believed a retreat had been commanded. Others believed reinforcements were coming. Neither was true. Attempts were made to rebuild authority. Surviving officers gathered in small groups, arguing over rank and legitimacy. Who had seniority? Who had confirmation? Who could be trusted? Each question created more division, because trust, once broken, does not return quickly. The army still had weapons, still had numbers, still had experience, but it no longer had identity. An army without identity becomes a crowd. A crowd does not fight wars. Scouts reported enemy movements, or thought they did. Every report was doubted, every message questioned. Because without command, information loses value. Truth becomes just another opinion. Within days, the force that had once terrified entire regions ceased to exist as a unified presence. Some units retreated intact, others scattered. A few surrendered. Not because they had been defeated, but because they could no longer see a future in fighting. This is the final victory of the assassins, not the deaths they caused, but the war they prevented from continuing. 6,000 warriors were removed from the conflict without a single decisive battle. And this is why this story matters, because it reveals a principle that remains uncomfortable even today. Power is not where noise is loudest. It is where decisions are made. Empires have risen believing they were protected by size. They have fallen when size became inertia. Every system grows confident. Every system grows predictable, and predictability is an invitation. What happened that night was studied quietly, imitated carefully, and remembered selectively, because no commander likes to admit that their greatest vulnerability is not the enemy, but their own structure. This was not an act of chaos. It was an act of understanding. Understanding how people obey, how systems depend on trust, how silence can do what violence cannot. 200 assassins did not win a battle. They ended a campaign, and campaigns shape history far more than battles ever do. If you are still here, listening to the end of this story, you already see the pattern. And if you want more stories like this, stories that reveal how power actually works, this is where you belong. Subscribe, not for spectacle, but for understanding. At dawn, 6,000 warriors were still alive. By nightfall, the war was already over, because long before weapons fail, command does.